Welcome to the podcast, Widening the Circle of Concern, a Sacred Story. We're your hosts, me, Sky Williams-Tao, and I use they, them pronouns, and Jamili Omar, who uses she, her pronouns. And this week, we're considering the question, what is this podcast thing anyway? And just to set us up a little bit, this is a Unitarian Universalist podcast, specifically. So it'll have a Unitarian Universalist or a UU religious lens. In Unitarian Universalism, we center our relationships with one another. And part of how we do that is with our covenants with one another. So for this podcast, we ask everyone, so that's us, anyone who might come on the show, and all of you in our audience, to join us in our covenant. And for today, we're actually going to usually we would say our covenant right now, but for this podcast, we're going to talk a little bit more about it later. And then to sort of get us here and arrived, I'm going to invite us all to just take a breath. You heard or saw Jamili taking some breath. And you can just check in with what's around you, check in with this podcast. Think about your senses. What are you hearing or seeing or touching? And just take a couple breaths with us, just to arrive here together now. And now I'm going to invite us into lighting a chalice, which is how tradition in Unitarian Universalism for opening up a sacred space together. And I'll talk a little bit more about what this chalice lighting reading is. But for right now, I'm just going to read it for you and hold up a chalice. We return to love again and again and again. We value what is true. We honor holiness. We try and we grow and we fail and we rest and we try. We are here together now. We need one another. We covenant.
Thank you for doing our reading, Sky. Will you tell us about the chalice that you held up?
Yeah, so this is it's a clay chalice, and I remember we made these one time when I was in YUU, which is a youth group growing up when I was in high school. And our youth advisor in our UU youth group just brought in clay, and that's what we did for that Sunday. And I'm almost certain I didn't actually make this chalice. It was somebody else, which feels meaningful.
Mm.
Yeah.
So you're a lifelong UU.
Yeah, I started Unitarian Universalism when I was 12. I came to the educating or our whole lives sexual education program, and then just kind of kept going. So I did coming of age and high school youth, and have been a UU since then. And so that's actually part of where the chalice lighting reading came out of. Was, I've moved around a bit for the last few years. So I was in Chicago, Middlebury, Vermont, and Syracuse, New York. And I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. And in a lot of those congregations, they share the same or similar reading that starts with, love is the doctrine of this congregation. And so I wanted, like, that reading has meaning for me because it's been sort of in these multiple places, but it didn't feel like it was as alive in sort of what I wanted and needed from like a a statement about covenanting. So that the chalice lighting is actually a rewrite of that that piece, that section.
Mhm.
And what about you, Jamili? What's your coming into UU story?
Well, I grew up Muslim, and I found Unitarian Universalism in about 2001, and did not immediately find a home. Had searched around, and then ended up coming back to it about 11, 12 years ago. So I say 20 years, but it's really been about 12. And it was when I was started teaching, I was teaching the 3 and 4-year-olds, that I really started to understand what Unitarian Universalism was and saw the power in it. So it was at that point where I got hooked. I got sucked into it. And the covenants, the agreements we make with each other and the promises we make to each other through our covenants are part of what I find is so powerful about Unitarian Universalism. The one creed we might have is that we need not think alike to love alike. And that feels very true about talking about our covenants. Do you want to tell us about this podcast and how it emerged?
Yeah. Yeah. So so I was actually working on Reverend Susan Frederick Gray's campaign for UA president, which I say because I think that's part of what introduced me to the Commission on Institutional Change's work for the first time. And so I feel like I was really following them throughout their whole processing and, reaching out to people. And, and I will say in that, I think that committee in particular was really good about reaching out to people and about having a very sort of dialogic way of doing their work. And then when they released the final report last summer, that was right before I was going to give a sermon. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to do it on the Institutional Changes report. And that also gives me the motivation to read the report, to be real honest. And part of, I'm not sure quite what clicked in putting together the idea for that sermon, but that's where I started thinking of this report as a Unitarian Universalist sacred text, which I'm sure in some ways comes out of the podcast Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And so that was last summer. I was thinking about that, and then I moved back to Phoenix last summer as well. And as part of that, I was looking at UU Justice Arizona, UU Jazz's stuff, and they had a conversation on the report. So I wanted to join and be part of that, and that's where I met Jamili.
Yeah, I think that's where we met.
Yeah, for the first time, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I don't know if you want to pick up the story from there.
Well, I don't think we actually had any breakout groups together, but we had a conversation about this document as a sacred text, and that really resonated with me in terms of being prophetic, and that role that sacred texts have of projecting the future, anticipating the future, giving a challenge for who would become in the future. And that's the role I see of this document is prophesizing, hey, if we do this work, if we do this stuff that's really super hard and we know it's going to be hard, we could become this, beacon on a hill or shining religion or whatever it is that we want to say it is. And we've got this work to do. And so when you said sacred text, it really resonated with me in that sense of being prophetic, that this could be who we become if we do the hard work.
Yeah, and I think that's also what, like, I remember when you named that, right? I think that's also something that speaks to me in this text and really is a call to, who we could be. Like, yeah. I think the other thing I want to name is we did have a little bit of a shift at the very end. It was just a little bit ago, because we started there, and then we've been talking about this for a while. From sacred text to sacred story. And as I remember that, I remember you sort of being like sacred text question mark. Like, and then I think I suggested the word story because it, like, when I think of theology, I think of like it being sort of broader than just about God, right? I mean, I like, and part of that for me is I also think about like the sort of scientific worldview that I grew up with as a theology, as a stories about the world. And story feels like it sort of gets to that place of all the different stories we have and we tell each other that help to make our realities.
I also like that story, in that stories are open and evolving. And this might be the story that we see for us for today, or the story we're evolving into today, and it can be rewritten by any one of us. Any one of us has the power to make that happen. So I really liked that reframe of from text, which feels very fixed and immobile, to story as evolving and additive and developing. The other piece that we talked about with this document was this report being an action rather than a noun. It's a verb rather than a noun. So it is a call back to covenant. And so when we were talking about the covenant for this podcast, we're talking about how Unitarian Universalism says we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of all persons. We believe in this interconnected web, which includes persons. And we don't always live up to that. And this document is the link between the belief and the action, and it's calling us back to living in that right relationship, living in covenant that we say we believe in. And so it's more of a push as a document rather than, it's definitely not, I don't think we should read it as a scolding document, but it's a push to live to our higher selves.
Yeah, and I think, I'm thinking about like the push and the invitation, right? Like I think both are present there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and so I'm feeling us bridge into we talked about talking about our own covenant, right, for this podcast. And I also did want to name, just hearing you say that one thing that this rewrite that I did of the Love is the Doctrine, I don't think I talked about, was it really came out of, at least in part, my sense of covenant as being something that we're actually sort of constantly having to return to, right? That is like sort of constantly being broken. And that like, I think sometimes we have this idea that it's like, oh no, like the like it's like this big deal. And not to say it's not a big deal to like be out of a right relationship, right? But I think it speaks to our like a sense of like discomfort with the idea that, like we do have internalized racism, and racism is against covenant. So like in some ways, like we are sort of constantly having to come back to this thing, this promises we make together, this way we want to be together. And that was part of where I think that is part of where that rewrite came from. And I think, yeah, I think I'm also thinking about like we talked a little bit before this about what some of the guiding principles we wanted for us. And again, with that invitation for those watching, or listening, for those who come on our podcast, to sort of be also come with us for some principles and some covenant.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I really want to say about covenant is that we have to practice it. It is itself a practice of doing it, but we also have to practice doing it and practice coming back to covenant, which means that we have to value the process of that over the product. We have to value the process of coming back to relationship more than always being in relationship, because we're human. We're going to fail at it. We're going to make mistakes. And as we were kind of perseverating on this podcast and worrying about our own personal failings and our internalized isms, just being worried that we're going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing or present it in the wrong way. And I think the agreement that we've come back to is that the process of doing it is more important than the final product that we come to in any given moment. And we can revisit those moments when we make a mistake or fall out of covenant. And that's really hard. I'm a perfectionist and I want it to be right and perfect and done. And so to say, no, it's the process of uncovering where the meaning is made and where the relationships are held.
Which I do love, and I think like one thing we talked about was having a covenant, having a static covenant. But actually, I feel like just hearing you say that, I think it is. I think we'll name some of the principles, right? Because we have some principles and some ideas that we really want to, let guide our work.
Right.
And like I think there's something really real in what you're saying, that it's not about the 5 lines that you write. Like in a way, it's about this, the practice and the process, and coming back and really trying to do like this important work, right? Of looking at this prophetic story about talking about the religion we love together.
Which I think is really important to name some of the starting places, both from the widening the circle and that you and I have talked about in terms of where we're starting. And one of the really important ones is that we are in a culture that promotes white supremacy, it promotes this cis heteropatriarchy, it promotes these values that we are swimming in. We're in them. And so it's hard for us to see outside of them because we're in them. And we want to ground this work in anti-racism. We want to ground this work in really accepting the challenge of taking it on.
Yeah, and I think a piece of that, like sort of a corresponding piece of it, I think that we talked about is just that this work gets messy, right? It can bring up a lot of feelings for us, for everybody, because we're all swimming in it, right? And it's so painful, right? We're swimming in this thing that's both like omnipresent and super painful for a lot of people. And so, I think this just has. I think we're just going to hold that as best we can, right? Knowing we will probably make mistakes, and we are committed to trying to be in right relationship with all of you in the audience, right? So if you, please be in contact with us, and we'll talk a little bit more about how later. But and just holding the fact that we're not perfect, and we're not gonna solve racism with this podcast, right? And we know it's so important, right? And so important for our faith. And so we are gonna talk about it and try our best with that.
Yeah. Yeah, that not only are we not going to solve racism, but that this document itself doesn't solve racism within Unitarian Universalism, but it does give us some steps towards living towards actions that more align with the values that we espouse, or with the theology that we espouse. And so pointing us that way, and this podcast pointing us that way. The other thing we talked about in depth is that this podcast is one way to access the document, but it is a second hand because it's through our lenses, and whoever guests we have on, but it's through our lenses, and it's not a firsthand account. And I'll say this again at the end of the podcast, I invite everyone to go and get the document. It's freely available as a PDF. You can purchase it as a hardcover or a soft cover. So it's freely available, and take advantage of that and read it if you can, if that's possible for you.
Yeah, and I think part of that is also there's actually a lot of videos out there from the Commission on Institutional Change. So like I said, like I actually had to kind of give myself a deadline to read this report, because I'm not somebody who loves reading dry reports. I do think this is important, so I do think you should read it, because I think I want to lift this up as a sacred story that I do think it's important to read. And there's a lot of videos of the commissioners talking. So if that's a better way for you to engage with this work, to listen to people talking back and forth as we're doing.
As we're doing.
Right. There's videos of the commissioner there's talking, like on the View podcast, or if you Google the Commission on Institutional Change, you might need to put a UU in there. They'll take you to a page that has a lot of videos of them, of conversation.
Right.
Um,
Seems like a good link we could put in the comments
right.
when we get to that point.
Right.
Were there any other guiding principles for this podcast that you wanted to lift up?
Yeah, I'm thinking about this piece that's like letting the Commission on Institutional Change's report guide the conversation a little bit, like trying to, as best we can, right? Trying to take read the document in its own terms, and engage with the work in the way that, I'm not quite sure how to say it, but like with sort of following the text. And so I did want to mention part of what we're doing is we will be going sort of line break by line break in the table of contents in the Commission's report. So if you want to read or engage with it in that way, and follow along with us, that's what we'll be doing.
My last career was teaching literature, and we would call that close reading. So we're letting the text guide how we're reading and interpreting the text. So that's a very internal conversation rather than bringing in outside influences to it. So really trying to read the text closely and share our thoughts on what is going on internally.
Right. And part of that, I think that you touched on, Jamelia, is also this like that we aren't commissioners, right? Like we actually weren't part, and so we're people who believe this report is a sacred story. So that's the angle, right, that we're coming at the text from.
I think the other angle that's really important to lift up is that we're both coming at this through the attitude of curiosity and wonder rather than knowledge and definitiveness, that we really are curious. What does this report say and how do we interpret this together? And then how does it influence our actions, behaviors, beliefs? And so really knowing that the questions we ask are genuine questions. What does this mean? And how do we interpret this and how do we apply it?
Yeah, and trying, I think, our best to let that guide us and go sort of move along with that, right? And sort of tying back to what we were talking about with process. These are sort of where we're starting from, and I think we're also gonna see where that goes and see what grows out of it, out of this conversation and of the questions we ask, and wrestle with together.
Right. And I think I hope one of the consequences will be disagreement. I hope we get to places where we say, oh, I think it means this thing, and you say, no, it means something completely different. And so we've talked about how activism, how religious work, the work that we're doing is a multi-lane highway, and it's got different avenues for all of us, for each of us to participate in. And some of us are going really super fast and some of us are not, and that's okay. That we each are on our own journey, hopefully headed to whatever that beloved community is that we're trying to build.
Yeah, and I think, I'm also thinking about like I think we've talked about not expecting the text to be perfect either, or the report to be perfect. And I'm thinking about just hearing you say that, I'm thinking about like this framing also that extending some grace to the report, that we're, I think, trying to extend to ourselves is this, this permission to be a little bit messy, and that though we might disagree with the text, and that doesn't mean we don't think it's prophetic, right? Or sacred, and that there might be something that could potentially grow out of, right, disagreements between us and the text, that actually might be a rich place too.
Yeah, absolutely. And a place for more wonder and curiosity.
Right.
I wonder why they came to this conclusion. I wouldn't have come to that. I'm excited to go in it through there. The other thing that was difficult when we had the conversation with the Arizona UUs was keeping anti-racism at the center, knowing that we both come from an intersectional lens and the overlaps and building of oppressions impacts the intersections of different privileges and oppressions impacts each person so very differently. And that this report is really about, focuses primarily firstly on racism and keeping anti-racism at the fore. We've had some discussions about how difficult that is.
Right, and I think that's something, you know, I think it's going to be a balance for us. You know, like, yeah, it's just is, like, I think that focus is important. I think, like, sometimes, like, it feels like to have that lens and to really, like, go, like, both because, you know, like, that's what the text asks us to do. That's what this report is asking us to do. And I think just for Unitarian Universalism, I think actually having that focus is really important. Yeah, and it is not the only oppression that exists, right? And we know that. Yeah, and yeah, and I think I did want to say, like, also, like, that is where I think, like, I identify as white, and I'm coming to that sort of with this lens, and that's part of where the close reading of the text feels really important to me, because I think it is totally possible to sort of take the text and then, like, say something that has nothing to do with what the text was saying. And so I, in that way, feel committed to really, like, doing that close reading, and that, you know, yeah, and that, like, that being one of the things that can anchor us in that way we want to approach this.
Yeah. Yeah. And for disclosure, my lens is as a second generation Arab American with light skin privilege. And so I exist in different spheres of oppression based on that, and spheres of privilege based on that. So it's really complicated untangling your own positionality in terms of race, and then taking on this layer of positionality and all the other intersections. It's gonna be a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, I'm like going back to the piece that it's like we wrote, like, this is like dicey waters, right? Just like, this is, you know, I'm thinking also, you know, like one lens I definitely bring to this is, like, having, like, anti-racism training, or, like, having talked about that before this, right? And, like, that does influence, right? You know, like just I'm, like, thinking about those, like, teasing out all the pieces we bring to any given conversation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
the other piece, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna name, like, I do think there's a real history of pain for people of color. You know, look, I think sometimes that's like, when people are bringing in, right, part of what people are potentially bringing in is, like, a lot of, I'm, like, trying to say this without swearing, like a lot of not kind or thoughtful things that people have said to them in our churches, right, in our communities.
Are you trying to name microaggressions and macroaggressions?
Yes, that's what I'm trying to name.
It's true. And Unitarian Universalism has done harm. We've done harm. Individuals and institutions have done real harm, particularly to Black, Indigenous people and people of color, but also to other marginalized and oppressed identities.
Right, and this is, I'm thinking, and we've done harm, right? I mean, like, and the flip side is we also have folks who have done harm, you know, intentionally, non-intentionally, like, you know, like, have hurt other people, and that's a complicated thing to navigate, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I'm just thinking about, like, feelings of, you know, shame, or feelings of, you know, like, whatever I sort of been internally about having hurt somebody else, right? When recognizing that, I do think there's a pain that can come from that.
Right.
Or
deny it.
Right. And like the sense of like, I'm thinking of like white fragility, right? Around denial and not wanting to be honest, right? About our mistakes and the way they've impacted others, or things we've done intentionally and the way they've impacted others, right?
Which I think is I think that's part of our covenant discussion, is having covenants or living into covenants that invite people back into relationship rather than shaming and blaming them when they fall out of relationship. And so how do we invite people that intentionally or unintentionally have caused harm back to relationship with us and say, you don't have to do that again, and we still love you. We know you caused harm and we still love you. You can be here and we still love you. You know, that calling back to community should be a part of our covenanting. And I feel like there are people who are going to read this report and say, I feel shamed, I feel blamed. I'm not being invited back to community, I'm being kicked out of community. And I'd like to name that. I don't think that that's what the document does, but let's explore that and see where we feel it does shame. Does it, you know?
Yeah. And I think I do want to just name the other piece of that to me, that's like also inviting back into community folks we've really hurt. And like and how, and I don't know the answer to this, but I think it's a real question of how do we do the redemption work, right? How do we do the accountability work? How do we do the
forgiveness?
Right. Like we hurt you, right? And like I don't know. And when we want to invite you back in, and it feels like it's not, there's also, you know, like how do you, I guess this is an open question for me. How do you invite somebody back in you've hurt? And what work do you have to do to like, to make that a real invitation and not just like, we're inviting you back in to get hurt again. Like, because that feels, you know, not right either.
Right. I'm curious how your imposter syndrome is feeling.
I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking, I don't know, somehow I feel like I'm talking to Jamili. Like this isn't the first conversation we've had like this. And that's actually, I feel like a more comfortable space for me, to like talk to somebody who I like trust to sort of be in conversation with around this, which I will say is not all Unitarian Universalists. I don't know, maybe I'm like thinking about that, and I'm also like, I know that I come from like some privileges, so I'm not sure how fair that is to say, but well, I guess it's fair to say, and right and
right and
and I guess I'm kind of coming back to this piece that's like, you know, all of this is true and everything we've talked about, and I love all of it, right? Like I feel really excited about where we're going. And like fundamentally, this is like, I want to talk to people about this report. Like and I think it's so important, you know?
Yeah.
And this has like gone all sorts of directions I wasn't expecting, and actually, you know, I want to talk about this report with you. I'm excited to do that. Specifically with the two of us, and you know, we can think about whoever else we invite on, but
yeah. I feel like that's a really good spot to transition to the what's next in terms of framing this experience. Is as we move through, we'll be finding ways for who's ever watching or listening to interact with us. We've brainstormed lots of different ideas, including email. If, you know, there's another way you can think of that you might want to get in touch with us, to include those ways. But definitely keeping at the fore that this is a dialogue, not just between the two of us or whoever else we interview, but that we believe that this document is inviting all Unitarian Universalists into a dialogue about the issues it brings up. And so how do we continue those dialogues, whether that's in, taking this video and showing it to people and having a discussion about it, or having your own small group, whatever it is, that's really important for us, is that the circle widens and everybody dialogues. Were there other goals that you had for this experience?
I think you got it. Yeah, I think you got it.
Okay, then we're going to try and end every session with an action or a challenge, something that as you're watching this that you can go and do. So it's not just all in our heads and stays in our bodies, but that there's something that you can go and what's the next step? If you've got ideas for next steps, send them to us. We'll incorporate those too. But I think the first one really is an invitation for everyone to access the report in some way, or access those videos that Skye was talking about earlier, that they're out there. We can probably link the websites. There is a freely available PDF, at least it has been freely available. Which I know is not everybody's preferred way of reading it, but it's free. And at least to be able to reference when we say on this page or this thing that you have access to it. So that's your challenge for now, is to get access to the documents, to the commission, to learn what it is you want to learn. And I will wrap us up with, if you want to show us our chalice again, I'll wrap us up with a little blessing for everyone. I wish you to go in peace. Wish you to go with your power. I wish you to go and do good in the world. And I wish for you to go knowing that you are loved.
Here at the end of the podcast, I wanted to say a few thank yous. So first off, thank you to Unitarian Universalist Justice Arizona, or UU Jazz, especially Janine Gelsinger, who had held a group to read through Widening the Circle that helped inspire this podcast, and just for all of her support in this process. And also a special thank you to Phoebe Dubich for designing our beautiful logo. Here in this first episode, I did want to do an image description of that logo for all of those of you who are following us on the podcast in an audio format. So the logo is a chalice that is being looked at from sort of an above and to the angle view. And around the chalice there are a bunch of hands that are resting on the edge, except for, and there's a little space, a cleared space, on the edge of the chalice closest to the person who is taking in the image. And these hands are of a variety of skin tones. They also have a variety of accessories. So there's a couple of different bracelets that people are wearing. One of the hands is wearing rings. One of them has a scrunchie on. One of them has what looks like acrylic painted nails. And somebody has a band-aid on. In the middle of the chalice is a little tea light that is lit. And near the bottom of the image is the UU Jazz logo, which is a saguaro that is acting as a chalice for a flame on top of it. The image also includes the title of the podcast, Widening the Circle as Sacred Story. I also want to mention that in the video rendition of this, Jamelia has taken the logo and put it onto a background of a starry sky. Yeah, so that's what that is. And again, thanks to Phoebe, I love this image. So I'm glad I get to share a little bit of it with you. And finally, I just want to say thank you to all of you for being with us, for reading through this with us, for following along. And just a reminder that you can contact us at uusacredstory@gmail.com. And we really are excited to hear from you and to hear your thoughts.